When Tom invited me to come participate, I was kind of torn between a couple of different papers. The one that I'm not presenting is looking at high-tech entrepreneurship among immigrants. That was something funded by the Kauffman Foundation. I'm happy to speak about that, in our sessions otherwise. But what I'd like to do here is talk a little bit about how the housing markets and the immigrants interact. We've heard a lot about vacancy and how immigrants have filled those vacancies. But when we think about that and think about some even the pushback in terms of what immigrants, the housing demand doesn't look quite the same as it does for the native population that may not have been there. And so that creates some tension and it's worth exploring and understanding. And so I've had a long-standing research agenda looking at immigrants and housing markets, trying to understand their housing demand, and this is kind of where I'm at today. And today I was really concerned in this particular paper in thinking about how can we measure changes over the economic cycle for immigrants? What are the kinds of things you could look at as markers for how their housing demand is changing over the economic cycle? So just some context, I have a colleague at USC, Dal Myers, a demographer who wrote this book called Immigrants and Boomers, and he was trying to link the shared fortunes of those two groups, mainly because the sizes are so similar. And he has a chapter in housing where he's very pessimistic about the ability of the millennial generation to buy the houses of the boomers, and so what that might mean. And so he's trying to make this argument about we need to do a better job educating and all these other things, which we would all agree with, so that they can buy the houses. It's important, and I don't think I need to say that in this room, but the millennials are bigger not because of fertility, but because of immigration and their children, so it is a different generation in character. What I want to do in today's talk is, again, as I mentioned, think about how you measure demand. And there's kind of three different ways that you can measure this demand, over time, or it could be over an economic cycle. One is to look at just the population shifts, where are immigrants going, what does that look like? You can think about shifts in housing tenure, by this I mean home ownership versus renting, or you can look at shifts in headship. And this is a rate that some of you may have used a lot, some of you may not have, but headship is simply the ratio of independent household heads divided by the adult population. So it gives you a sense of how many households are occupying housing units. So I'm going to start with the first one. This one I might be able to go through quickly to keep on time. So I have some maps here. I do want to describe the maps. If you're interested in looking at them later, you can do so. So what I've done is if you think about 1980, I split the immigrant population, percent born into quintiles. And so you can see that basically the darker shading means that there's a higher percentage of the immigrant population in these places. And you can see where is it dark in 1980? Well, it's dark here, it's dark in the tips, and it's dark in California. What we know is that immigration has spread out to these new destinations. And I think the short story is, look at the middle of the country in 1980, even 1990, you started to see it get a little darker in Atlanta, South Carolina, North Carolina, Colorado, etc. But by 2010, I didn't change the quintiles. The quintiles are from 1980. You can see that immigrants are all over. And this story is largely true whether we're talking about the Latino population, which basically mirrors the previous map, or we're talking about the Asian population. The only difference is that you have a few places like Minneapolis that are more important for the Asian immigrants than others, right? But the basic story is true. What was just alluded to in Phil's talk just previously is that this kind of immigration does not, this is population flows, and that's really important, but there's a different character of that immigration and population flow. And what we do know matters a lot for housing demand is the percent of the foreign-born population that is new. So as a lot of the work I've done has shown that the probability of becoming a homeowner if immigrants have been in the country more than 10 years is almost like the rest of the population, conditional on their incomes and so forth. Before that, it's not for many reasons, because they're more mobile, they have higher mobility and those sorts of things. And so what's really changed is, this is what the quintiles were in 1980, and it's, in places like, California and kind of all over the country, you had kind of a diversity in terms of the percent of the foreign-born population that was new versus more seasoned. Again, the more seasoned would be the light colors, the newer, higher percentage of the immigrant population that's new would be the darker colors. In 1980, what we saw is in places, you saw lots of, again, immigration from Latin America. Look at California, it was really dark in terms of the coloring, and then Florida, and then, this is a little bit, these are still lighter places. What's happened by 2010 is that in California, the vast majority of the immigrant population is not new anymore. It's a very seasoned immigrant population. This is relevant for even the discussion And Ross talk about, kind of vacancies and understanding what's happening. And, if you look at only the big cities like Chicago, California, and New York, these immigrants are quite different than the immigrants throughout the country, so you would expect to see different results. But what you see in these other parts of the country is that's where the darker shading is happening, which means that's where immigrants, are mostly new. And so that does matter for how immigrants are received, and it also matters for, in this talk, thinking about their housing demand and what that looks like. So that's all I want to say about population flows. I don't have time to talk more about it today, but I'm happy to chat later. So the next kind of thing that we could look at is home ownership. And it turns out, how we might think about home ownership is worth revisiting. So the basic home ownership statistic is household based. So it's just simply the percentage of household heads that are homeowners divided by the number of total households. However, if you have multiple families living together, you basically have kind of one homeownership unit, right? And so again, this notion of the character of the housing demand is worth thinking about. An alternative, which hasn't been used very much, is something that you might call per capita or population based. It has the advantage of taking into account the fact that multiple families might be living together, or children might be living longer with families. Has the disadvantage is that no one has any clue what it is compared to the homeownership statistics that we're used to seeing. So there's also some other technical disadvantages, but I think it's worth just kind of looking at. This is, in some ways, an explanation or an exploration of the data, and I have future work more on the kind of structural modeling of thinking, how you think about these things. So for a moment, I hope you can see the basic chart. So what I've done, and again, this will be more for looking at later, is I tried to kind of look at so here's, this column might be of special use. This is the national data. This is for the gateways. These are the emerging gateways according to Singer, and then you can kind of get the remainder of the top 100, 200, and then the rest. So this is the home ownership rate over time. So for immigrants in the 1980, home ownership was over 50%. The wave of immigration in the 80s, it dipped down, and then by the end of 2010, it was up again. This is for native borns. You can see it started off, much higher in the 65% range. It went up, and then it's come back down in 2010 and actually continued to fall. So one thing that's not fully appreciated, even with this measure of home ownership, right, is that immigrant home ownership nationally has been going up, and it went up kind of from 2000 to 2010. It went up even through the crisis, if you will. Now it's true, and I have a paper coming out in Urban Studies in 2014 that showed that for some groups in some places, really, it got above this point in 2006, and then it tailed off. But in some places, remarkably, for example, Latino home ownership in small metros went up through the crisis, right? Which people don't fully appreciate. Now, part of that is a compositional change because the new immigrant flow cut off in 2008. So part of it's just a composition and an aging. But one of the things immigrants actually, to use the term integration or assimilation, they do quite quickly is integrating the housing market. And so that's interesting. Now, if you look at kind of this population-based measure, of course, it's starting at a lower base because we have more of the population in there. But really, all I want you to do is to try to kind of compare the trends from this to this, and you can see that for immigrants, it basically it kind of looks the same. I mean, for the native borns, this tail off from 2000 to 2010 was a little bit greater because more adults were living with other adults. And so that's kind of getting to this headship measure. I split it up between the black population, white population, the Latino population, and the Asian population. There's not as many black immigrants, so maybe we should focus our attention over here. And you can see that kind of the comparison of some of the gains that the black population had experienced between 1990 and 2000, and actually went up against 2006, eroded pretty rapidly after the housing crisis. And this decline is even greater if you account for the kind of the population base in terms of people who are no longer independent household heads. For the white population, you can see that this kind of headship decision, this kind of burden of having more people, more adults living with in housing units was kind of exacerbated in a way. If you look at the white native-born population, you can see this kind of slowly increasing trend, which this has started to fall back even more again. But if you look at the population base, it's kind of a steady decline. So it's not, these aren't big changes, right? But it just kind of gives you a different picture. It gives kind of we need to be alert of the fact that this is another changing character of housing demand. You can see these declines in the gateways were kind of larger. Look at the dramatic difference between this and this. And what that says is that the way the white population's home ownership rate was going up was not necessarily because they are just more of the overall population that are kind of independent homeowners. What was happening is the denominator was changing, that the number of household pets was declining. Okay, and so again, it's a fact in the data that people haven't paid a lot of attention to, and I think it's worth, but I still haven't figured it out, as I'm happy to say, like, how do you model this? What does this mean in long term? But that's kind of the process that I'm in right now in my work. The Latino population, so what do we have here? The same kind of story on the immigrant side of kind of this 1980 decline to 1990, but then, kind of the good news of increasing home ownership, and you can see that it varies depending on whether you're in smaller, cheaper places to live or the gateways. The basic trend, though, is very similar, whether you're talking about population or the household-based measure. But if you look at the native-born Latinos, you see this kind of trend that you saw in the native-born population, where there's again this kind of steady decline in the population-based measure. The tricky thing, it turns out, if you're going to use data and classify people, is that who you classify as native matters. So I'll get back to that in a moment when we talk about headship rates, but it's kind of where do you do with the children of immigrants who are natives and where do you put them? And this will become obvious when I talk about headship. The Asian immigrant population versus the Asian native population, you can see huge gains in home ownership among the Asian immigrant population over these 4 decades. The population-based measure is much smaller to begin with. As you'll see, they have much lower headship rates, the Asian population does, but the kind of pattern is similar. The native-born kind of home ownership rate, even the household rate, has been actually slightly declining over time. So that this rate is almost the same as this rate now. And then if you incorporate kind of headship changes, then it's declining even more. So that's just kind of context for home ownership. Is this the right way to measure housing demand? Well, partially, but it's just a piece of the overall picture. So then I want to turn to, and probably most of the talk is going to be about this particular measure, which is headship. When you think about housing demand, we talk about vacancies, we're talking about occupying actual physical units. And so certainly headship matters for how we understand that, because an independent head has made the decision to occupy an independent unit. So looking at changes in headship tell us something about how many units are being occupied, and of course understanding how to model that is complicated because you have demographic factors and the housing market factors and those kinds of things all acting together. But at its most basic level, this is housing demand. How do you understand household formation? This is taken from a recent paper in the Journal of Urban Economics. Just this figure, it's complicated. That's a short story, right? You can become a renter, you can become an owner. You can become an owner because you got married, so then 2 individual people kind of join together. You can kind of move within this state, up and down. You can have housing change or transitions in this state. It's a complicated set of things, and so it's really hard to capture all of these transitions in a single model. And so, one of the things that might be interesting in this paper kind of focused on the transition of adult children leaving, because this is an interesting margin which might be especially sensitive to the economic cycle. And so in this paper, I'm not going to only talk about just general headship, which includes all the adult population, but focus on children and the percentage of children who are living at home is kind of this maybe potentially interesting margin, and also potentially less subject to some of the, I would say, the selection bias and endogeneity issues that we would encounter trying to model headship on its own. So let's just look at some of the data, which I hope proves interesting, just to kind of get a sense of how this has changed over time. So again, headship is looking at the number of household pets divided by the overall adult population. So this kind of 50% rate, if you will, in the overall population, you have obviously kind of people living alone, you have a man and a woman or partners, living together. That's going to be a 50% rate. If you have other children, adult children, that's going to drop it below 50%. So that's where those numbers come from. And you can see that for immigrants, they have a headship rate in 2010, which is about 9 percentage points lower than the native population, and then that's kind of declined over time, whereas the headship rate of native-borns has increased and then declined, just in general terms. Again, we can look at the black population, white population first, and you can see that there were actually increases in the headship rate for white native-borns and for black native-borns fairly dramatically, and then they declined after the Great Recession. It's interesting that the black headship rate and the white headship rate is quite similar. And this is despite, on average, very vastly different resources. And so obviously there are demographic kind of transition or demographic explanations for this, but this also has interesting implications for wealth accumulation and other things. If there's just more headship, more kind of independent living, there's expense there to do that and so forth. That deserves a whole other kind of set of research that I can't talk about today and I haven't done yet, but I think is worth doing. So now I want to look at the Latino population and the Asian population, where the most recent waves of immigrants reside, and then talk about some interesting issues, whether you include those second generation kids with their immigrant parents or not. So what we see in terms of Latino headship is it's basically been fairly flat from 1990 on. Some slight decline, whereas the native-born population has seen a headship that's also had a slight decline. I should say this was a decline and an increase. If you take the children of immigrants and classify them with their immigrant parents, you see a slightly different story where Latino native-born headship has been pretty flat, but the Latino immigrant headship, so the burden of the adult children still living with their parents, has increased. If you look at the Asian population, something kind of, I would say, you see this apparent, especially from 2000 to 2010, yet the headship was going up. And the native-born declining quite a bit when you look at it, the children reclassified, you see a slightly different pattern there. So that's consistent. The other thing that is true is that the Asian headship rate is very similar to the Latino headship rate. And again, on average, the resources are different, so there's interesting implications to be thought about there. So the last thing I wanted to look at just in the data is to look at the percentage of adult children living with parents. So these are 18 to 30-year-olds, and how has that changed over time? Well, perhaps not surprisingly, from 2000 to 2010, you see this uptick for all groups. And this was largely due to the Great Recession, or at least partially attributed to the Great Recession, I should say. If you split it up by nativity, you see that the increase, is roughly similar in terms of the two groups. The immigrant, the rate of children living at home is actually lower. And this is something that people might not have fully appreciated. I know I didn't fully appreciate it, that there's less adult immigrant children living with their parents than there are native children. Now again, those native children might actually be second generation, right? So it's just important to kind of keep this in mind, like who's living where and so forth. And you see these patterns kind of by race and ethnic group, with one exception, no change among the Asian immigrant young adults. Looking at over the cycle of these measures, just to give you a sense of that, what happened to home ownership, this is, the white ownership file, the black ownership file even more. You can split it up among the different groups, and you can see this pattern kind of throughout, where the Asian native kind of fell. These are slightly different times. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into all the details. And then this was looking at headship. Again, it's mostly a story of decline in headship. So this are two different kind of hits on housing demand, right? Home ownership fell and headship fell. So it's kind of the double whammy, if you will. Immigrant headship over the cycle, though, didn't change as much as native headship, and that's kind of a persistent picture. So that's kind of interesting in and of itself. And then, I'm going to skip this one. This talks about how you can begin classifying children with their parents or not with their parents, but just for sake of time, I'll jump ahead. The final thing is the children over the cycle. How many adult children are living with their parents? And you can see there's kind of the gradual uptick for the white population, a larger uptick for the black population, not as much change for Asians, and then more so for Latinos. And this is looking at natives versus immigrants. And then here, once again, for Latinos, you saw actually a big change. And that's something to keep in mind, whereas the Asian population, you saw a smaller change. So I wanted to just kind of end with some, basically exploratory modeling and trying to think about, can we explain from the data what are the correlates of these changes in headship and these changes in the percentage of adult children living at home. And so if you go to the literature on household formation from the housing side of things, there were these early papers in 1986 and 1993 that kind of basically pointed to the role of housing cost. Okay, and so these were important to help, kind of influence demographers to say, well, we need to include a few more variables in our models that we weren't using before. More recent papers have, kind of motivated by the fact, these two especially, Hart and Rosenthal and Myers and you, said that, maybe our home ownership rate went up, not because we actually had, more people kind of owning homes, but because there were fewer pets. And so they both have kind of found that. And then these recent papers are trying to look at, with a couple of my graduate students, one is now a professor, one is going to be on the market next year, so that's a plug for for her, Jen Choi. And so we're trying to understand how the recession impacts household formation and how quickly it can come back. So what I did is I estimated a couple models, a model of headship, models of the rate of adult children living at home. Here's what I found in general terms. I found that Asian adults had the lowest headship of any group. Latino and African American headship is similar and less than white. Immigrants have the lowest headship. Greater English proficiency and a greater time in the U.S. increases headship, so these are probably not surprising. We found that higher rents and unemployment rates lower headship. Again, these are also not surprising, but there's some challenges in a simple model of headship, and that's kind of how do you deal with the marriage decision in this a simple model. The data show that education and income have different effects in this reduced form model, and how do you deal with housing tenure choice? So those are those questions. I know my time is extremely short, so I'll just wrap up here with the child kind of model. So what did I find there? I found that non-white children are more likely to live at home than white children. Asian young adults are the most likely to live at home after controlling for other things. So this actually pushes against the raw data a little bit, but after controlling for these resources, that's what we find. We have native-born children are the most likely to live at home, and that corresponded with the data that you saw. And Latino immigrants are less likely to live at home than other immigrants. Higher housing costs and higher unemployment rates result in more people living at home, as you would expect. But again, there's these challenges, like how do you deal with income? So is it the individual income, the household income? Household income and those resources can actually provide resources for children to establish a dependence, but at the same time can make it more comfortable for them to stay home. Because there's more income, there's not kind of the push factor. And this other question, kind of how do you treat the multiple ways that a child can leave a home, and do you treat them equally or not? In a simple model, we'll kind of treat them the same. So I'm going to end with that because I know my time is up, and basically say there's a lot to kind of think about as it relates to modeling housing demand and how you go forward with that. I think I'm kind of intrigued by this kind of notion of looking at just young adult children as a marker. So if what you're trying to do is help policymakers look at these shifts in demand, I think looking at the young adult population might be a better place than just look at the overall headship rate. So that's where I'll leave it.